is risk? This is one of those terms, and I use this. I want to use this very carefully, because oftentimes when we think about risk, or more importantly, when the public thinks about risk, the public thinks about risk from the framework of the difference between who I'm afraid of and who I'm mad at. It's a concept of thinking. It's a concept of thinking about what we've done in our society. There are two kinds of criminals: the ones we are afraid of, and the ones that we are mad at. And what we have done in our current culture is we have gotten to the point where we send lots of people that we are mad at to prison, or to jails, or to institutions, because we're mad at their behavior. What's the problem with sending people that we're mad at to prisons or jails or institutions or YRTCs or whatever the case may be? What's the problem with that? Aren't we holding them accountable? Maybe too high of accountability. What else is the problem with that? They may not be able to understand what they wrong. I'm going to take you up a higher level. Politically, what may be wrong with that? We're overcrowding our system, costing us lots and lots of money to put people into institutions that may or may not be effective. Yes? Morally, it's wrong. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that when we think about risk, and I want to tie that back to the organizational development again, make sure that when you're talking to the public about support of your problems, you're distinguishing the difference between risk to recidivate, because that's what we're talking about here. Your job is to reduce that potential for recidivism. Okay? You're not talking about risk you're not talking about risky behavior in terms of public safety here. All right? And the reason I emphasize here is because you're ultimately increasing public safety. You're ultimately increasing public safety. But there is a big difference between those offenders that we are mad at and those offenders that we are afraid of. The offenders that we are afraid of, and I want to go into the adult world for just a second, but the offenders that we are afraid of are truly those kinds of offenders that we do need to lock up. There is a certain population that we really can't do anything about. Assessment. Big time. Assessment. There's lots of things that we can do that we can tell the difference. When you're looking at assessments, and that's such a great question, because we're looking at what is the causation, what is that predictive cause behind that. If I have someone whose whole criminal record is precipitated by that criminal thinking alone, guess what? We just said that's a pretty static factor. There's not much I can do about that. It's the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world whose psychopathy is basically not something that we can easily influence.
Okay, that's exactly it.
Please do.
A child molester, what's your assessment? Your assessment doesn't
That's a great question. One of the, and we're going to go down, let's go down that bunny trail for just a second in terms of child molestation. One of the things that is hardest when we discuss child molestation is the ick factor. Let's be honest. It's the ick factor. It's one of the most deplorable things that we could do in relationship to that. We also know when it comes to child molestation, we haven't found a lot of research that says that we can change behavior. There is a lot of research out there that says that we can control the behavior, but not a lot of research that says that we can change the behavior. The problem that we have with child molestation is we have a propensity to, and we're really down a bunny trail, so I apologize for those of you who are going, how does this have to do with diversion? But the problem that we have with child molestation is we have a propensity to throw sex offenders into one big ball. And really, there are so many different types of sex offenders that we have to be clear about who we're talking about. And we have to know the evidence behind that. You know, the 19-year-old with the 15-year-old, some people might call that child molestation. Other people might call that cognitive deficiency or development issues. You know, where that 19-year-old is really cognitively more like a 15-year-old. You have to understand the research and the difference. So I think it's incredibly important that you do understand those things. And the reality is, there's some things that we just simply have made a decision to punish. And I think child molestation is a good example of that. But do we say, because there's a child molestation, because they've been convicted of child molestation, should we put them in and keep them in forever? The chances are more than great they're not going to be in there forever. There's only a tiny percentage of people in our jails and prisons that will be there forever. The rest we have to be honest about. We got to know what works, because they're coming out sooner or later. And we either got to control them or we got to treat them. So that's kind of the bunny trail. The point that I'm getting across here, though, is making that differentiation about when you refer to risk. That we want to be clear about risk of recidivism or continuing their delinquent behavior. We want to be honest about understanding that the higher the risk, the higher the likely to recidivate. So the harder our job is. Those of you who purposely choose higher risk juveniles, you probably don't have the outcomes that the lower risk programs do. That's okay. Especially if you're articulating that that's because we have higher risk juveniles and we can prove that we have higher risk juveniles. And assessments help you do that. Low risk are not as likely to reoffend. Sometimes low-risk programs are often criticized because the research will tell you that even without an intervention, there's a fairly good chance that they would have straightened out on their own anyway. So how much resources do we really want to put into them? So that's why they say things like, for low-risk programs, don't over-supervise. Do what works, get them back on track, and get them out of there as quickly as possible.